Congresswoman, you came to America as a refugee. This country gave you everything. Why do you hate it so much? The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The Senate hearing room, usually a cavern of shuffling papers and whispered consultations, fell into a silence so absolute it felt physical. Even the stenographer froze, her fingers hovering over the keys, waiting for a breath that no one in the room dared to take. Vice President JD Vance sat perfectly still. He was marine straight, his posture rigorous and unyielding, his eyes locked on Representative Ilhan Omar with the intensity of a target acquisition system. There was no anger in his face, no performative outrage. There was only the terrifying calm of a man who had spent months in combat zones and knew exactly when to pull the trigger. He possessed the focus of someone who knew that this moment, right here, right now, was not just a hearing. It was a reckoning. Representative Omar shifted in her witness chair. The confidence she had carried into the room, the same practiced Teflon confidence that had survived 100 cable news battles and Twitter skirmishes, flickered. It was a micro-expression, a momentary widening of the eyes, a slight tightening of the jaw, but it was long enough for the high-definition cameras to catch it. And C-SPAN wasn't the only one rolling. Every major network had interrupted their regularly scheduled programming. Cable news screens were split. Social media was exploding in real time. This wasn't supposed to happen. The hearing had been billed as a routine examination of refugee resettlement success stories. It was supposed to be a victory lap for the progressive left, a platform for Omar to showcase her journey and advocate for open borders. Instead, the vice president, an Appalachian success story and the youngest VP in modern history, had turned the script to ash. The gallery behind them was packed to capacity, divided like a wedding where the families despise each other. On the left side sat the progressive activists, women in solidarity hijabs, college students holding "Refugees Welcome" signs, and members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. On the right side sat the veterans in dress uniforms, service medals glinting under the harsh overhead lights, alongside Gold Star families. And in the middle, sitting with quiet dignity, were Somali-American refugees, not activists, but real people who had built businesses, joined the military, and loved the country that took them in. They watched, and they waited. Senator Chuck Grassley, the committee chairman, leaned into his microphone, the feedback whining briefly. "Vice President Vance," Grassley said, his voice gravelly, "the witness has been sworn in. You may proceed." Vance didn't move immediately. He let the silence build, stretching it until the tension was almost unbearable. He wanted America to lean forward. He wanted them to listen. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, almost gentle, which made the words land with even more force. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." Vance looked down at the folders arranged before him with surgical precision. They were 3 inches thick, color-coded, and overflowing with government documents, public records, and FEC filings. This wasn't a political hit piece. It was a forensic audit. "Congresswoman, I want to start by acknowledging something," Vance began. "Your story is remarkable. A refugee camp in Kenya, arriving in America at 12 years old, naturalized at 17, elected to Congress at 36. It is an incredible journey." Omar relaxed slightly, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. This was familiar territory. She knew how to handle praise for her biography. "By any measure," Vance continued, "you represent the potential of the American dream. The promise that anyone can come here, from anywhere, and succeed." He paused, his hand moving to the first folder. Which is why what I am about to show America is so disturbing. The heir left the room again. Omar's lawyer, a high-priced fixer from K Street, leaned forward instantly. The progressive activists shifted in their seats. The veterans leaned back, arms crossed, satisfied. Vance opened the folder. The sound of the paper turning was the only noise in the room. He pulled out a document encased in a clear plastic sleeve and held it up for the cameras. The Department of State seal was clearly visible at the top. "This is your family's refugee application from 1995, Vance said. "I want to walk through how you got here." He pulled out another document. "What you have done since." Another. "The money you have taken." Another. "The statements you have made." One more. "The allegiances you have maintained." Omar reached for the glass of water on her table. Her hand trembled, just enough to cause ripples in the glass. Vance looked directly into the lens of the C-SPAN camera, breaking the fourth wall. "What you are about to witness is not a partisan attack. It is not Islamophobia. It is not racism. It is accountability with evidence." He turned back to Omar. "Let's start with how you got here. While thousands of Somali refugees waited years, sometimes decades, for resettlement, your family's application was processed in exactly 8 months. Let's talk about privilege." Vance signaled to an aide, and a projection screen illuminated behind him. It showed a timeline, split into 2 columns. The contrast was immediate and devastating. "On the left," Vance said, using a laser pointer, "is Ahmed Hassan. He applied for refugee status in 1992 from the Dadaab camp in Kenya. Same circumstances as your family. Same threat level. Do you know when he arrived in America?" Omar stayed silent. 2001, Vance answered for her. 9 years. He waited 9 years in that camp. 9 years of uncertainty, heat, and dust, watching his children grow up in temporary shelters, hoping for a miracle. He pointed to the right column. "Your family applied in January 1995. You arrived in October 1995. 8 months. Vance let the numbers hang there. 8 months, while others waited 8 years. The average Somali refugee in the early 1990s waited 3 to 7 years. Your family was in the top 1% for processing speed. Why?" "I don't control the refugee system," Omar said, her voice tight. "No," Vance agreed. "But someone advocated for you. Someone with influence. We pulled the sponsor records. Your father's application listed sponsors and organizations providing support. Do you know what is interesting? These organizations were led by individuals who later employed your father, who employed your sister, and who later donated to your political campaigns." "It is almost like your family had access," Vance said softly, "and others didn't." In the gallery, a Somali-American man stood up. "I waited 6 years," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "My family waited 6 years in that same camp." Chairman Grassley banged his gavel. "Order! Be seated or be escorted out." But the murmurs had already spread. Other refugees in the room were nodding, their faces hard. They remembered the waiting. They remembered the desperation. And they were wondering, for the first time, what Ilhan Omar's family had that they didn't. Vance continued, relentless. "Congresswoman, do you consider your family's 8-month processing to be a privilege?" "That isn't privilege," she deflected. "Privilege implies receiving special treatment, unavailable to others in similar circumstances," Vance corrected. "Is that not what happened?" He pulled out another document, this one a bank statement from 1997. "This is your father's bank account, 2 years after arriving in the United States. The average refugee family had saved maybe $2,000 at that point. Your father had $47,000. Gasps rippled through the room. How does a taxi driver save $47,000 in 2 years while supporting a family of 7 and paying private school tuition? Vance asked. Because you didn't go to public school, did you? You went to a private college prep school. My father worked very hard, Omar snapped. I'm sure he did, Vance said. But the math doesn't add up unless there was outside help, unless there were connections. You didn't just get the American Dream, Representative. You got the VIP pass. Vance closed the first folder. The foundation was laid. She wasn't the struggling survivor she claimed to be. She was the beneficiary of a system she now spent every day attacking. We will return to privilege, Vance said. But now that we've established how you got here, let's talk about how you stayed. He reached for the second folder. It was thicker. Let's talk about your marriages, Vance said. Plural. Let's move to how you stayed in America, Vice President Vance said, placing his hand on the second folder. Your path to citizenship is even more interesting than your arrival. He opened the folder and pulled out a marriage certificate. The paper crinkled in the silence of the room. Let's talk about your marriages, plural, Vance repeated. Representative Omar went pale. The journalists in the press section began typing frantically. This was it. These were the allegations that had dogged her for years in the dark corners of the internet and conservative talk radio. It was the elephant in the room that no one in Congress, Republican or Democrat, had dared to address officially under oath. Until now. Your immigration status was secured through marriage, Vance said. Multiple marriages. Marriages with interesting timing and highly questionable circumstances. He held up the certificate for the cameras to see. Let's walk through this timeline together, Congresswoman, because I think the American people deserve to understand exactly how you obtained your citizenship and whether that process involved federal fraud. Omar's hand shook violently as she reached for her water glass again. She took a sip, but her throat was so dry she could barely swallow. The room leaned forward. This was about to get much, much worse. Vance signaled the aide, and a new graphic appeared on the screen. It was a timeline, stark and linear, exposing the contradictions of her life. Let me walk everyone through this carefully, Vance said, his voice turning into that of a prosecutor closing a case. 2002. You married Ahmed Hirsi. This was a faith marriage in the Somali tradition. Is that correct? Yes, Omar said, her voice barely a whisper. In the Islamic tradition. It is recognized in our community, even if not by Minnesota law. I understand, Vance nodded. Different cultures have different customs. That is fine. So, in the eyes of your community, you were husband and wife. He moved to the next entry on the timeline. 2009. You and Mr. Hirsi had your first child, a son. You were still in your faith marriage, correct? Yes. Also, 2009, Vance said, his voice hardening. The same year you had a child with Mr. Hirsi, you legally married someone else, a British national named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. Is that correct? The room went silent. The juxtaposition was jarring. Yes, she said. Why? The question hung there. Simple. Direct. Impossible to answer honestly without incriminating herself. Why did you legally marry Mr. Elmi if you were in a faith marriage with Mr. Hirsi and had just had a child with him? That is a personal matter, Omar deflected, falling back on the standard politician's defense. It becomes a public matter when it involves immigration law, Vance countered instantly. He pulled out a stack of papers clipped together. This is an apartment lease from 2010. The address is 3744 10th Avenue, South Minneapolis. The names on the lease are Ilhan Omar and Ahmed Hersi. Vance looked up over the rim of the documents. Your legal husband was Ahmed Elmi, but you were living with Ahmed Hersi. You were legally married to one man, but living with another. Explain that arrangement. Omar's lawyer stood up, buttoning his jacket. Mr. Chairman, these private matters have no bearing on refugee resettlement. This is harassment. They have bearing on immigration fraud, Vance shot back, not looking at the lawyer. Marriage fraud is a federal crime. 5 years in prison. A $250,000 fine. This committee has a legitimate interest in whether a sitting member of Congress committed that crime to circumvent the laws she now votes on. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Chairman Grassley banged his gavel hard. Order! The Vice President has the floor. When the quiet returned, Vance looked at Omar with an expression of clinical curiosity. Let me continue, he said. He clicked through a series of slides on the screen. 2010 tax returns. You filed jointly with Ahmed Hersi. Your legal spouse was Elmi. 2011. Your second child was born. The father listed is Hersi. Your legal spouse was Elmi. 2012. Your third child was born. The father is Hersi. Legal spouse, still Elmi. 2013 through 2017. Social media photos show you with Hersi at family events, vacations, holidays. In one caption from 2015, you call him my rock, my everything. Vance paused to let the timeline sink in. You were married to Ahmed Elmi until 2017. For 8 years, you were legally married to him. But during those same 8 years, you lived with Hersi, had children with Hersi, filed taxes with Hersi, and presented Hersi to the world as your husband. Explain this, Vance commanded. The silence stretched. Omar looked at her lawyer. He shook his head slightly. Don't answer. I have nothing to say about my personal life predating Congress, she said robotically. Then let me talk about the immigration benefit, Vance said. Ahmed Elmi received his green card through your marriage in 2011. He received his citizenship in 2012. Vance set the papers down. You marry him when he needs status. He gets the green card. He gets the citizenship. Then you divorce him 5 years later and immediately marry Hersi, the man you had actually been with the entire time. He looked out at the gallery, addressing the American people. Does this seem like a legitimate marriage to you? Or does it look like an immigration arrangement? He pulled up a comparison chart on the screen. Legitimate marriage-based green cards require evidence, Vance explained. Joint bank accounts, joint leases, photos together, testimony from friends, evidence of a shared life. Next slide. Your marriage to Elmi? Joint bank accounts? None found. Joint leases? None. Photos together? None. Testimony? None. Evidence of a shared life? None. This marriage had zero evidence of a relationship, Vance concluded. What it had was an immigration benefit. Mr. Elmi got citizenship. And you? What did you get? The implication hung heavy in the room. There were allegations, rumors that Vance wouldn't dignify without absolute proof, that Elmi was her brother, but he didn't need to say it. The fraud was evident enough on its own. There are allegations regarding the specific nature of your relationship with Elmi, Vance said carefully. I won't repeat them without DNA evidence, but what I will say is that the pattern suggests an immigration arrangement, not a marriage. And if that is true, it is fraud. He held up a copy of the federal statute. Title 8, U.S. Code, Section 1325, Marriage Fraud. Any individual who knowingly enters into a marriage for the purpose of evading any provision of the immigration laws shall be imprisoned for not more than 5 years. Are you accusing me of a crime? Omar's voice rose, shrill and defensive. I am presenting evidence that raises serious questions that have never been adequately answered, Vance replied. Questions involving potential federal violations. He set down the statute. And I am noting that a member of Congress who may have committed immigration fraud has spent her entire time in office advocating for looser immigration enforcement. The irony is not lost on anyone. In 2016, Vance added, Minnesota investigators found you filed joint tax returns with Hersey in 2014 and 2015 while married to Elmi. You were ordered to pay back taxes and fines. You called it a mistake. It was a mistake that saved you money and misrepresented your marriage status to the federal government, Vance said. He looked directly at her. Immigration benefits through convenient marriages, tax benefits through false filings, legal status benefits while living a different reality. He closed the folder. I want to be clear. I am not calling for a prosecution today. That is not my role. But I am saying these questions deserve investigation. Real investigation. By immigration authorities, by law enforcement. Because what I can tell you, Vance said, his voice dropping to a hush, is that someone who obtained their status through questionable marriages shouldn't be lecturing America about immigration enforcement. Someone who gamed the system shouldn't be defending others who game it. He picked up the third folder. It was even heavier than the last. Let's move on, Vance said. Let's talk about what you have said about America, about Israel, about Jewish people, because your marriages might be murky, but your statements are crystal clear. Vice President Vance reached for the third folder. It was black, distinct from the others, carrying a visual weight that seemed to darken the mood in the hearing room instantly. Let's move on, Vance said, his voice dropping to a lower, more somber register. We have discussed your arrival. We have discussed your marriages. Now, let's talk about what you have said, about America, about our allies, and specifically, about Jewish people. Representative Omar stiffened visibly. This was the terrain where she felt most persecuted, the battlefield where she had fought her most bitter skirmishes with her own party. You often dismiss criticism of your statements regarding Israel as Islamophobic, Vance began, opening the folder. But I am not going to offer my opinion today. I am going to read your own words, your own tweets, your own votes. He signaled the aide, and a series of social media posts appeared on the large screen behind him. They were magnified, the timestamps and retweet counts clearly visible. Let's start with 2012, Vance said. During a conflict in Gaza, you tweeted, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Vance looked at her over the rim of his reading glasses. Hypnotized, he repeated. That is not a policy critique, Congresswoman. That is a trope. An ancient, ugly, anti-Semitic trope about the crafty Jew deceiving the world through sorcery or mind control. You admitted years later that this was offensive, but then you did it again. He clicked to the next slide, the infamous 2019 tweet. It's all about the Benjamin's baby. You were explaining why American politicians support the Jewish state, Vance said. You didn't cite shared democratic values. You didn't cite security interests. You cited $100 bills. You invoked the age-old smear that Jewish money buys control of governments. I apologized for that. Omar interrupted, her voice sharp. I was learning. You apologized, Vance acknowledged. And then, 3 weeks later, you said, I should not be expected to have allegiance to a foreign country. The room went dead silent. Dual loyalty, Vance said, letting the phrase hang there. The accusation that Jewish Americans are not truly American, that they are a fifth column, that they are more loyal to Tel Aviv than to Washington. That is the rhetoric that has justified pogroms and expulsions for centuries, and you used it against your own colleagues. Vance pulled out a voting record, holding it up like an indictment. But words are just words. Let's look at your actions. Because your voting record reveals a hostility that goes far beyond legitimate criticism of a government. July 2019, the House voted on Resolution 246, opposing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement, a movement that seeks the economic destruction of the world's only Jewish state. The vote was 498 to 17. You were one of the 17. September 2021. The House voted to fund the Iron Dome missile defense system. This is a purely defensive weapon. It does not kill Palestinians. It stops rockets from killing Israeli civilians. It saves lives. The vote passed overwhelmingly. You voted no. Vance leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. You were one of only 9 members of Congress who voted against protecting Jewish children from incoming rocket fire. Why? Does a Jewish child not deserve protection? Or do you believe the rockets are justified? I oppose unconditional military aid, Omar argued, gripping the microphone. I oppose funding a machinery of oppression. It is an interceptor missile, ma'am, Vance shot back. It stops murder, and you voted to defund it. He picked up a letter from the pile. This is a letter from 70 Jewish members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, asking you to stop using anti-Semitic tropes. 70 of your colleagues told you that your words were hurting them. Your response was to accuse them of trying to silence you. Vance set the letter down and stood up. He walked around the table, entering the well of the Senate floor. He stood 10 feet from her. Congresswoman, I am going to ask you a direct question. It is a simple question. A yes or no question. The gallery held its breath. Do you believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state? Time seemed to stop. Omar's eyes darted left and right. She looked at her lawyer. She looked at the progressive activists in the crowd. She licked her lips. I believe in a two-state solution where— That is not the question. Vance cut her off. Yes or no? Does the Jewish state of Israel have a fundamental right to exist? I support a political process that guarantees— You can't say it, Vance said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. You literally cannot say the word yes, because you don't believe it does. That is the answer, Vance said, turning his back on her and walking to his chair. Your hostility isn't about policy. It isn't about borders. It is existential. And your silence just screamed louder than any tweet you ever wrote. Vice President Vance sat back down, the silence in the room still vibrating from the confrontation over Israel. He didn't give the audience time to recover. He reached for the 4th folder, the one filled with spreadsheets and bank records. Let's talk about money, Vance said, shifting gears from ideology to greed. Because while you have been focused on Jewish money and politics, you seem to have been very busy moving your own campaign funds into your family's bank account. He opened the folder and pulled out a photo of a man with a beard and glasses. This is Tim Minot, Vance said. Your current husband. He runs a political consulting firm called the E Street Group. Omar's face went pale. Scandals about tweets were one thing. Scandals about money brought down politicians. "Shall we follow the money, Congresswoman?" Vance signaled the aide, and a complex flow chart appeared on the screen. It showed a pipeline of cash flowing from Ilhan for Congress directly into the accounts of the E Street Group. "Most Americans don't understand how campaign finance works," Vance said. "Let me break it down. Donors give you money to win elections. They think they are fighting for health care or justice. But let's see where their donations actually went." He pointed to a massive number on the screen. $2.8 million. That is how much your campaign paid your husband's consulting firm between 2019 and 2020. Nearly $3 million in donor money, funneled directly into a company owned by the man you share a bed with. "We complied with all FEC regulations," Omar's lawyer interjected, speaking for the first time. "It was fair market value for services rendered." "Let's talk about fair market value," Vance countered, pulling out a comparative analysis. "The average House campaign in a safe district, and yours is a D+30 district, you won by 40 points, spends about $300,000 on digital consulting for a full cycle. You spent $2.8 million. "What did you buy for that extra $2.5 million? Vance asked. We looked at the itemized receipts. He read from a list. "Digital strategy, $312,000 in a single quarter. For a race, you were guaranteed to win. Video production, $289,000. That works out to roughly $4,600 per video. The industry average is half that. Travel expenses, $67,000 in 2021 alone." Vance held up a travel receipt. "Travel to Miami, Florida, $3,800, listed as fundraising consulting. But we cross-referenced the date with your Instagram." A split screen appeared. On the left, the FEC filing showing the payment to her husband's firm. On the right, a photo from Omar's Instagram account dated the same weekend. It showed her and Manette on a boat in Biscayne Bay, smiling, holding drinks. The caption read, "Recharging. You used campaign funds to pay your husband's firm to send you both on a vacation," Vance stated flatly. "That isn't consulting, that is embezzlement." "We have more," Vance continued. "Travel to New York, the St. Regis Hotel, $4,500. Travel to Los Angeles, the Four Seasons, $6,200. All paid to the E Street Group, all coinciding with dates where no campaign events were scheduled." "You turned your campaign into a family business," Vance said. "You realized that you couldn't just take the money out of the campaign account for yourself. That's illegal. But you can hire your husband, pay him double the market rate, and then the money becomes household income. It's a laundering operation." "That is a lie!" Omar shouted. "My husband is a top-tier consultant." "Then why did your fundraising go down?" Vance asked, pointing to a graph. "In 2022, after paying him millions, your small-dollar donations dropped by 12%. Either he is terrible at his job, or the point of the payments wasn't to raise money. The point was to transfer donor cash into your personal bank account." Vance picked up a legal document. "This is the Federal Election Campaign Act. It prohibits the personal use of campaign funds. It specifically states that payments to family members must be for bona fide services at fair market value." He looked at her. "Paying your husband $300,000 for digital ads in a district where a Democrat could win without spending a dime is not fair market value. It is theft. It is stealing from the grandmother in St. Paul who sent you $20 because she believed you were fighting for her." "You weren't fighting for her," Vance said, closing the folder. "You were fighting for a better room at the St. Regis." The Campaign Legal Center filed a complaint. The Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust filed a complaint. Watchdogs on the left and the right looked at your books and saw the same thing. You are getting rich off your voters. Vance leaned back, the weight of the evidence settling over the room. You rail against capitalism, he said softly. You attack the wealthy. But you have figured out how to monetize political outrage better than any Wall Street banker. You are a profiteer, Congresswoman, and your product is division. The progressive activists in the gallery shifted uneasily. They could defend the tweets. They could defend the votes. But the money? The luxury hotels? The payments to the husband? That was harder to swallow. It smelled like the very corruption they claimed to hate. And speaking of living like the wealthy, Vance said, reaching for the next folder, let's talk about how you live when you're not on vacation. Because the contrast between your lifestyle and your district is illuminating. Vice President Vance placed the campaign finance folder on the stack, which was now growing perilously high. He reached for the next one, this one glossy and filled with high-resolution photographs. We have established how you pay your husband, Vance said, his voice steady. Now, let's talk about how you spend that money on yourself. Because the contrast between the way you live in Washington and the way your constituents live in Minneapolis is illuminating. He signaled the aide. The screen behind him split into two distinct images. On the left was a gritty gray photo of a street corner in Minneapolis's 5th District. Boarded-up windows, slush on the sidewalk, people waiting for a bus in freezing temperatures. On the right was a sleek glass and steel high-rise building gleaming in the sun. This is the Odyssey, Vance said. A luxury condominium complex in Logan Circle, Washington, D.C., where you reside. Your unit rents for $3,100 a month plus fees. That is more than the total monthly take-home pay of the average family in your district. Vance read from a brochure for the building. Rooftop pool with Capitol views, state-of-the-art fitness center, private yoga studio, 24-hour concierge. He paused, looking up. And my personal favorite, a pet spa. Your building has spa services for dogs, Vance said, while families in your district are choosing between heating bills and insulin. You rail against income inequality on television, but you go home to a fortress of privilege that 99% of your voters could never dream of entering. I need a safe place to live due to security threats, Omar argued, though her voice lacked its usual force. Safety is one thing, luxury is another, Vance countered. Let's look at how you get around. You are a vocal proponent of the Green New Deal. You tell Americans they need to give up their cars and take public transit to save the planet. Vance pulled out a spreadsheet of her transportation expenses. According to your FEC filings, between 2021 and 2022, your campaign paid for 847 Uber and Lyft rides. Total cost, $47,290. Your office is 3 blocks from a metro station, Vance noted, but you spent nearly $50,000 on private car services. Let's look at specific rides. He held up a receipt. March 22, 2022. You took a $67 Uber from your apartment to a climate change rally. A ripple of laughter, nervous, shocked laughter, went through the room. You took a private fossil fuel-burning car to a protest about ending fossil fuels, Vance said. That isn't just hypocrisy, Congresswoman. That is contempt. You believe the rules are for the little people, not for the vanguard. And then there is the food, Vance continued, moving to the next section, where the champion of the poor eats dinner. He flashed receipts on the screen. Viola Mare, $347, Italian seafood, one of DC's most expensive restaurants. Nobu, $556, charged to the campaign. But this receipt, Vance said, holding up a specific document, is the one that breaks my heart. The Capitol Grill, 423, March 15th, 2020. Vance let the date hang in the air. That was the week the COVID lockdowns began. That was the week restaurants in your district were being forced to close. Small business owners were watching their life's work evaporate. Families were lining up at food banks in Minneapolis, terrified they wouldn't have enough to eat. And while your constituents were standing in the cold waiting for a box of pasta, Vance said, his voice tightening with controlled anger, you were eating a $60 steak on the donor's dime. You were living it up while your district was dying. That is legitimate campaign engagement, Omar protested. It is legitimate gluttony, Vance corrected. He moved to the final section of the lifestyle audit, the wardrobe. You have positioned yourself as a woman of the people, Vance said. But your closet tells a different story. Photos from her Instagram appeared, annotated with price tags verified by fashion editors. Max Mara blazer, $2,195. Valentino rock stud handbag, $3,195. Jimmy Choo heels, $700. Gentle Monster sunglasses, $385. You own at least 6 pairs. Even your hijabs, Vance noted, are often Versace or Hermes, costing $400 to $800 each. I don't care if you wear nice clothes, Vance said. You earn a good salary. Spend it how you want. But don't stand on the floor of the House and lecture working-class Americans about their privilege while you are wearing a blazer that costs more than their car. You are performing poverty, Vance said, closing the folder. You treat the struggles of your constituents as a costume you put on for cameras. But when the lights go off, you go back to the pet spa and the steak dinners. You aren't one of them anymore, Vance said softly. Maybe you never were. You are the elite you claim to hate. The Somali Americans in the gallery were looking at the photos of the luxury handbag next to the photos of their dilapidated neighborhood. The betrayal on their faces was palpable. They had sent her to Washington to fight for them, and she had used their support to buy a ticket to a club they weren't allowed inside. Vice President Vance cleared the table of the financial documents. He reached for the final folder. It was thick, heavy, and marked with a single word: loyalty. Your lifestyle is hypocrisy, Vance said, his demeanor shifting from accountant to inquisitor. But hypocrisy is common in Washington. What is uncommon, and what is dangerous, is where your true allegiance lies. This brings us to the most painful question, Vance said. When you look in the mirror, do you see an American? Or do you see something else? I am an American citizen, Omar shouted, sensing the trap closing. Paperwork makes you a citizen, Vance said. Loyalty makes you an American. Let's look at your words, he signaled the aide. A video clip played on the screen. It was grainy, recorded on a phone at a private event in Minneapolis. Omar was speaking in Somali to a room full of Somali men. The subtitles ran across the bottom. We are Somalis first, Muslims second. This is temporary. Our nation is Somalia. We must use our positions here to help our people there. The video ended. The room was silent. That translation is false, Omar claimed immediately. That is a right-wing mistranslation. I said we must honor our heritage. I thought you might say that, Vance said. So I brought an expert. He gestured to the gallery. Sergeant First Class Abdi Hassan, please stand. A man in the gallery stood up. He was wearing a U.S. Marine Corps dress blue uniform. On his chest were ribbons for tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was Somali by birth, American by choice. Sergeant Hassan is a native Somali speaker, Vance said. He served as a translator for U.S. Special Forces. Sergeant, you reviewed this tape. Is the translation on the screen accurate? Yes, Mr. Vice President, the sergeant said, his voice booming. She said, "We are Somalis first. This is temporary. Our nation is Somalia. There is no ambiguity." "Thank you, Sergeant." Vance turned back to Omar. "You told a room of people that your American citizenship is temporary, that your real nation is Somalia, that your job in Congress is to help our people there, not your constituents here." "That is the definition of a fifth column," Vance said. He pulled out a graphic comparing her social media history. Left column, tweets about America. Vance read a selection. "America is fundamentally broken. Systematic oppression. This country's greatest sin." Right column, tweets about Somalia. "Beautiful Somalia. Our homeland. Somalia's future is bright." "You describe America, the country that saved you, as broken, oppressive, and sinful," Vance said. "You describe Somalia, the failed state you fled, as beautiful and bright. Which country do you actually love?" "I criticize America because I want it to be better," Omar said. "That is patriotism." "You don't criticize," Vance corrected. "You condemn. You have never, not once in 4 years, criticized the Somali government. You have never criticized Iran. You have never criticized China. But you attack America daily." "And then there are the trips," Vance said. January 2019, April 2019, August 2020. "You traveled to Somalia multiple times. You met with the Somali president. You met with foreign ministers. You toured government buildings." Vance held up a document. "This is the Congressional Foreign Travel Report. Members of Congress must report official meetings with foreign officials. Your name appears 0 times for Somalia. You hid these meetings." "What were you discussing with a foreign government in secret?" Vance asked. "The Logan Act prohibits private citizens from conducting foreign policy. Were you negotiating aid? Were you sharing intelligence?" "I was visiting family." "In the presidential palace?" Vance asked skeptically. "That's a hell of a family reunion." "Let's put it to the test," Vance said. "I am going to ask you a hypothetical question. It is a loyalty test. Every American in this room could answer it in a heartbeat." Vance leaned over the table. "If a war broke out between the United States and Somalia, which side would you support?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "That is a ridiculous hypothetical," Omar stammered. "We are not at war." "It is a question of the heart," Vance pressed. "If American soldiers, like Sergeant Hassan there, were fighting Somali soldiers, who would you want to win? The country you swore an oath to? Or the country you call our nation?" "I would support peace." "You can't say it," Vance said. "You can't say America. Even in a hypothetical, you cannot bring yourself to side with the United States against Somalia." "Your silence is the answer," Vance said. "Your loyalty is divided, and a house divided against itself cannot stand. And a representative divided against her country should not sit in Congress." The Somali Americans in the gallery were shaking their heads. They knew the cost of loyalty. They had fought for it. And they were watching a woman who treated it like a disposable commodity. "You have one allegiance," Vance said, closing the folder, "and it isn't to the flag behind you." Vice President Vance stood up from the table for the first time in the hearing. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, holding the final folder. It was thinner than the others, but it carried a gravity that silenced even the shutter clicks of the press cameras. "We have discussed your privileges," Vance said, his voice echoing in the hush. "We have discussed your money. We have discussed your loyalties. But there is one thing left. One statement. One moment that defines the chasm between you and the country you claim to serve. He opened the folder and pulled out a single photograph. He didn't put it on the screen immediately. He held it in his hand, looking at it with a reverence that was personal. September 11th, 2001. Vance said the date like a prayer. "I was 19 years old," Vance said, looking at the audience, not Omar. "I was a student at Ohio State. I watched the second plane hit the South Tower on a television in the Student Union. I remember the smell of the room. I remember the silence. I remember knowing, in that instant, that the world had changed." He turned the photo around. It was the iconic image of the Twin Towers burning, black smoke billowing against a crystal blue sky. 2,977 Americans died that day. They weren't soldiers. They weren't politicians. They were secretaries. They were janitors. They were stockbrokers. They were fathers dropping their kids off at school. They were murdered by 19 Islamic terrorists who hijacked 4 commercial airliners and turned them into missiles. Vance turned back to Omar. His expression hardened. "And how did you describe this event? The worst terrorist attack in human history?" He signaled the aide. An audio clip played over the speakers. "Cairo was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something, and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties." The clip ended. The words hung in the air. "Some people did something. Some people did something," Vance repeated, tasting the words with disgust. "Not Islamic terrorists murdered 3,000 people. Not Al-Qaeda declared war on America. Just some people. Like it was a random accident. Like they littered." Vance flashed a new image on the screen. It was a photo of firefighters at Ground Zero, covered in ash, carrying a body bag. "The first responders did something," Vance said, pointing to the screen. 343 firefighters ran into burning buildings while everyone else was running out. They climbed stairs they knew would collapse. They died saving strangers. That is, doing something. "Flight 93 passengers did something," Vance continued. "Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, they charged the cockpit. They fought the terrorists with their bare hands to keep that plane from hitting this very building. They gave their lives to save ours. That is, doing something. But you—" Vance looked at her with open contempt. "You reduced their sacrifice to a vague inconvenience. You made the story about you, about Muslims losing civil liberties. You centered the narrative on your victimhood while the ashes of 3,000 Americans were still cooling." "I was talking about the aftermath," Omar shouted, her composure cracking under the weight of the room's judgment. "I was talking about how innocent Muslims were targeted." "You couldn't even say the word terrorist," Vance countered. "You couldn't say murder. You erased the crime to protect the identity of the criminals." Vance walked over to the gallery. "I didn't come alone today," he said. "I invited some people who have wanted to speak to you for a long time." He gestured to the front row. "Please stand." 3 people stood up. A man in a firefighter's dress uniform holding a helmet. A woman in her 60s, clutching a framed photograph. A man with visible burn scars on his neck and hands. "Lieutenant Michael Stackpole, FDNY, retired," Vance introduced. "He was at Ground Zero. He lost 6 men from his company that day. 6 brothers. "Robert Sanchez. He was at the Pentagon. He suffered 3rd-degree burns on 30% of his body. He has had 17 surgeries. "Patricia Smith." Vance looked at the woman holding the photo. Her husband, Bobby, worked on the 101st floor of the North Tower. He called her at 8:50 a.m. to say he loved her. The line went dead at 10:28 a.m. when the tower collapsed. Vance turned to Patricia Smith. "Mrs. Smith, the floor is yours." Patricia Smith stepped forward to the railing. Her hands shook, but her voice was steel. She held up the photo of her husband. "Congresswoman," she said, "his name was Robert. He wasn't some people. He was my husband. He coached Little League. He loved the Yankees." She took a breath. "He was murdered by Islamic terrorists. I want you to say it." The room was deathly quiet. "I want you to look at his picture," Patricia demanded, her voice breaking. "And I want you to say the words, 'Islamic terrorists murdered your husband.'" Omar looked anywhere but at the woman. She looked at her papers. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at her lawyer. I mourn the loss of all life," Omar stammered. "Say it!" Patricia screamed, the raw pain of 20 years pouring out. "Say who killed him! Don't you dare sanitize his death! Say it was terrorism!" Omar froze. She couldn't do it. To say the words Islamic terrorism was to betray the ideological framework she lived by. To her, admitting the religious motivation of the attackers was a concession she refused to make. "I condemn all violence," Omar whispered. "You coward," Lieutenant Stackpole growled from beside Patricia. "You absolute coward." Vance stepped back in. "She won't say it, Mrs. Smith," Vance said gently, "because she puts her politics above your husband's life. She puts the feelings of the attackers above the grief of the victims." "You have your answer," Vance said to the room. "She cannot condemn the ideology that killed 3,000 Americans because she is more aligned with the grievance of the terrorist than the patriotism of the victim." He looked at Omar one last time. "You spit on their graves, Congresswoman, and you did it from the floor of the House." The emotional devastation of the 9/11 confrontation hung over the room like a physical weight. Ilhan Omar was no longer the defiant politician. She was a diminished figure, shrinking into her chair as if trying to disappear. But Vance wasn't finished. He had one final blow to deliver, the one that would strip away her last defense, her claim to represent her own community. "You claim to speak for refugees," Vance said, returning to the witness table. "You claim to be the voice of the Somali diaspora. You claim that anyone who criticizes you is attacking them. Let's see if they agree." He signaled to the 3 Somali-American men sitting in the center of the gallery. "I would like to yield the remainder of my time," Vance said, "to the voices you have silenced." The first man stepped up to the microphone set up for public testimony. He was older, wearing a suit that was clearly his Sunday best. "My name is Muhammad Ali," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "I drove a taxi in Minneapolis for 20 years. I raised 3 daughters. One is a doctor, one is a teacher, one is a nurse." He looked at Omar with profound disappointment. "We came here with nothing. America gave us a life. You came here and you complain. You shame us, Ilhan. When you talk about America like it is evil, people look at us and think we are ungrateful. We are not ungrateful. You are ungrateful." He sat down. The second man stood up. Ahmed Yusuf, a business owner. "I own 3 restaurants," he said. "I employ 27 people. I pay my taxes. I love this country. You tell young Somalis that they are victims. You tell them America is racist. You are poisoning their minds. You are teaching them to hate the only country that will give them a chance." "You do not represent me," he said. "You represent yourself." Finally, the third man stood. Captain Abdi Hassan, the Marine officer. He didn't need a microphone. His command voice filled the room. "I bled for this country," Hassan said, holding up his hand to show two missing fingers, lost to an IED in Afghanistan. "I fought the Taliban. I fought the people who think like you." "I am an American," Hassan said. "Not a Somali American. An American. And when you stand there and refuse to condemn terrorists, when you refuse to say you love this country, you spit on my service." "You are a traitor to the refugee dream," Hassan said. Vance nodded to the men. "Thank you." He turned back to the screen. "We polled your district last week," Vance said. "We asked Somali Americans in Minnesota's 5th District a simple question. Does Representative Omar reflect your values?" The results appeared on the screen. Yes, 34% no, 52% unsure, 14%, 52%, Vance read. "The majority of your own community, the people you claim to own, don't want you. They are tired of the scandals. They are tired of the division. They are tired of having to apologize for their congresswoman. They know the truth," Vance said, "that you use them. You use their identity as a shield for your corruption. You use their trauma as a stepping stone for your celebrity." Vance closed the final folder. The stack on the table was now a tower of damning evidence. "This hearing is about refugee resettlement," Vance said, addressing the chairman. "And the lesson is clear. Refugees who come here with gratitude, like Captain Hassan, like Mr. Ali, are the best of America. They renew our spirit. But refugees who come here with entitlement, who take everything and give back nothing but contempt, they are a warning." Vance looked at Omar. "You had it all, Congresswoman. You had the power. You had the platform. You could have been a bridge. Instead, you chose to be a demolition crew." "You are not a victim," Vance said. "You are a tragedy of your own making." "Mr. Chairman," Vance said, gathering his papers, "the record speaks for itself. The evidence is public. The truth is out. I yield back." Vance turned and walked out of the hearing room. He didn't look back at Omar. He walked past the 9/11 families, who nodded in silent thanks. He walked past the veterans, who stood at attention. The room erupted into chaos as reporters surged forward. But the story was already written. The video clips were already uploading. The viral storm was already brewing. Ilhan Omar sat alone at the table. Patricia Smith's photo of her husband, Bobby, was still propped up against the microphone, staring at her. And for the first time in her career, Ilhan Omar had absolutely nothing to say. The hearing adjourned at 12:15 p.m. By 12:30 p.m., the internet had broken. It wasn't just a political news cycle, it was a cultural event. The clips didn't just circulate, they detonated. Clip 1, Patricia Smith, the 9/11 widow, slamming the photo of her husband on the table and demanding Omar say the words, "Islamic terrorism." Omar's silence, her refusal to look at the photo, her eyes darting around the room, was being played on a loop on every platform from TikTok to Telegram. It was a moment of moral cowardice so visceral it needed no commentary. Clip 2, Captain Abdi Hassan, the Somali Marine with the missing fingers, declaring, "You are a traitor to the refugee dream." That clip hit the veteran community like a thunderclap. Within hours, John Traitor Omar was trending *1 globally. Clip 3, Vice President Vance's closing monologue. "You had it all. Instead, you chose to be a demolition crew." The legacy media tried to spin it. The Washington Post ran a headline, "Vance uses hearing to attack prominent Muslim congresswoman." CNN hosted a panel debating whether the DNA test discussion was racially charged. But the receipts were too strong. The documents Vance had put on screen, the marriage timeline, the luxury travel receipts, the translated videos, were irrefutable. Fact-checkers who usually rushed to Omar's defense stayed silent. There was no way to fact-check a bank statement. The political fallout was swift and brutal. 3 days later, Ilhan Omar sat in her campaign headquarters in Minneapolis. The mood was funeral. "Fundraising is dead," her finance director said, looking at a laptop screen that showed a flat line. "We usually raise $50,000 a day after a high-profile attack. Since the hearing, we have raised $400, and we have received 3,000 refund requests." "The small-dollar donors are gone," the director continued. "They saw the St. Regis receipts, Ilhan. They saw the pet spa. They feel scammed." But the money was the least of her problems. The real problem was outside. A crowd had gathered outside her office. It wasn't MAGA Republicans. It wasn't white nationalists. It was Somali elders. It was Ethiopian immigrants. It was the very people she claimed to own. They held signs that read, "Gratitude, not grievance, and not in our name." Inside the Democratic Party, the quarantine had begun. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries leaked a private comment to Politico. "We cannot defend the indefensible. The marriage fraud evidence is compelling. She is on her own." Then came the challenger, the announcement. 1 week after the hearing, Captain Abdi Hassan stood at a podium in a VFW hall in Minneapolis. He wasn't wearing a designer blazer. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He didn't have a team of consultants. He had his neighbors. "My name is Abdi," he said into the microphone. "I was born in Mogadishu. I was raised in America. I fought in Afghanistan. I am running for Congress because I am tired of being represented by someone who hates the country that saved us. I am running on a simple platform: gratitude." "When you come to America," Hassan said, "you make a deal. America gives you freedom. You give America your loyalty." Ilhan Omar broke that deal. She took the freedom and kept her loyalty for herself. "I am Somali. I am Muslim. And I am an American patriot. In that order. Always." The speech went viral instantly. It wasn't polished. It was raw. It was the antidote to Omar's celebrity slickness. Donations poured in, not from corporate PACs, but from veterans, from immigrants, from people who wanted to believe that the American dream was still about contribution, not extraction. Primary night, August 2026. The campaign was vicious. Omar tried everything. She called Hassan a puppet of the right. She accused him of internalized Islamophobia. She spent her remaining war chest on attack ads, claiming he was a sellout. But the voters had seen the receipts. On election night, Ilhan Omar didn't rent a ballroom. She stayed in her luxury apartment in D.C., watching the returns on CNN. The results weren't close. Abdi Hassan, DFL, 67%; Ilhan Omar, I, 33%. It was a landslide, a repudiation, a total collapse. In Minneapolis, the victory party was raucous. Somali flags waved next to American flags. People were crying, not tears of loss, but tears of relief. They felt like a stain had been washed away. Captain Hassan took the stage. "Tonight," he said, "we sent a message to Washington. You cannot use our identity as a shield for your corruption. You cannot use our trauma as a currency. We are not victims. We are victors. Ilhan Omar is the past," Hassan declared. "We are the future." Back in D.C., Omar turned off the TV. There was no concession call. She simply tweeted a single bitter sentence: "The corporate machine wins again." Even in defeat, she couldn't admit the truth. It wasn't a machine. It was the truth. January 2027. The swearing-in ceremony of the 120th Congress was a solemn affair. On the floor of the House, where Ilhan Omar had once preened for cameras and scolded her colleagues, a new figure stood. Representative Abdi Hassan raised his right hand. His left hand, the one with the missing fingers, lost in service to this country, rested on a Quran that had been carried by his grandfather out of the Civil War. I, Abdi Hassan, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He said the words with a ferocity that echoed off the walls. He wasn't just reciting a script. He was making a vow. Watching from the gallery was Vice President JD Vance. He had broken protocol again to be here, to witness the end of the story he had written in that hearing room. He watched Hassan embrace his family, a family that had waited in line, followed the rules, and loved their new home. Later that afternoon, Vance sat for an interview with 60 Minutes. "Mr. Vice President," the interviewer asked, "looking back at the hearing with Congresswoman Omar, do you have any regrets about how harsh you were? Some called it a partisan destruction." Vance leaned back in his chair. He looked older, hardened by the years of governance, but his eyes were clear. "It wasn't partisan," Vance said. "It was necessary." Ilhan Omar was a test for this country, Vance continued. She tested whether we still had standards. She tested whether we still believed that citizenship requires loyalty. She tested whether we would allow someone to use the American dream as a weapon against America. And we passed the test. "Where is she now?" the interviewer asked. "She is in obscurity," Vance said. "Where she belongs." It was true. Ilhan Omar had vanished from the public stage. Without the platform of Congress, without the ability to generate outrage from the floor of the House, she had lost her currency. The cable news shows stopped calling. The speaking fees dried up. The squad had moved on, eager to distance themselves from the toxicity of her legacy. She was reportedly living in Los Angeles, trying to shop a memoir that no publisher wanted to buy. The title she had proposed was Unbowed, but the market had spoken. America wasn't interested in her defiance anymore. They had seen the receipts. "But look at who replaced her," Vance said, pointing to a monitor showing Congressman Hassan speaking on the Capitol steps. "That is the real story," Vance said. "We traded a grifter for a patriot. We traded someone who married her brother for papers, for someone who gave his fingers for freedom. We traded some people did something for I pledge allegiance." "That is the system working," Vance said. "There are two types of people who come to this country," Vance concluded, delivering the final verdict on the era of Ilhan Omar. "There are those like Abdi Hassan. They come here, they see the lights, and they say, 'Thank you. How can I add to this light?' They are the builders. They are the Americans. And there are those like Ilhan Omar. They come here, they take the warmth, and they say, 'Why isn't it brighter? Why do I have to share it? Why is this country so flawed?' They are the tenants. They never become owners. They just complain about the rent while trashing the furniture." "We decided," Vance said, standing up to leave, "that we are done with tenants. We want owners." The interview aired that Sunday. It was watched by millions. In a luxury apartment in Los Angeles, Ilhan Omar watched it alone. She saw the clips of Hassan being sworn in. She saw the crowds cheering for him. Her crowds, her people. She saw the country moving forward, stronger and more unified without her voice sowing division. She turned off the TV. She looked out the window at the smoggy California skyline. She had come to America with nothing. She had risen to the very top. And through her own arrogance, her own greed, and her own ingratitude, she had lost it all. She was finally, truly, just a refugee again. But this time, there was no country waiting to take her in.